Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Shidqie, and I would like to read you the book and the title of Toward Islamic Anthropology: Definition, Dogma, and Directions by Akbar S. Ahmed. And let's just scroll down to the part 1, which is we're gonna read it together. I will read it for you so we can understand it together. This is the part 1, Introduction, the Science of Anthropology, Anthropology and Other Science of Man, Anthropology and the Colonial Encounter. We will read that part inshallah. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The Science of Anthropology. The study is speculatory and concerns a difficult and complex subject. Its task is made more difficult as it defends a metaphysical position, advances an ideological argument, and serves a moral cause. It will therefore remain an incomplete part of an ongoing process in the debate on key issues in contemporary Muslim society. The major task of anthropology, or the study of man, is enable us to understand ourselves through understanding other cultures. Anthropology makes us aware of the essential oneness of man and therefore allow us to appreciate each other. It is only quite recently in history that it has to come to be widely accepted that human beings are fundamentally alike, that they share basic interests and so have certain common obligations to one another. This belief is either explicit or implicit in the most of the great world religions, but it is by no means acceptable today to many people even in advanced societies, and it would make no sense at all in many of the less developed cultures. Among some of the indigenous tribes of Australia, example, a stranger who cannot prove that he is a kinsman, far from being welcomed hospitably, is regarded as a dangerous outsider and may be speared without compunction. Members of the Lugbara tribe of northwestern Uganda used to think that all foreigners were witches, dangerous, and scarcely human creatures who walked about upside down and killed people by magic. The ancient Greeks believed that all non-Hellenic people were barbarians, uncivilized savages whom it would be quite inappropriate to treat as real people. Many citizens of modern states today think of people of other races, nations, or even cultures in ways which are not very different from these, especially if their skin is differently colored or if they hold other religious or political faiths. An eminent British anthropologist has noted, when I was an administrator in Tanzania, it was widely held that Europeans were cannibals who kidnapped African children and others and processed them for sale as tinned meat. Some European stereotypes about Africans were no less absurd. I have heard Europeans who had lived for many years in Africa, but who had never bothered to learn an African language properly or to get to know any Africans outside the master-servant relationships, assert that Africans are lacking in nature family affection, that they don't know the meaning of gratitude, and that their languages lack a word for thank you. I did not here discuss in detail the historical development of social anthropology. Full accounts are available elsewhere, but it will be easier to see why contemporary social anthropology is the kind of subject It is if we have some idea of what has led up to it as a branch of empirical observational science, it grew up in the context of the worldwide human observational science. It grew up in the context of the worldwide human interaction, which has vastly increased in the past century. What is most familiar is often taken for granted, and the idea that the study of living human communities was of legitimate scientific interest in its own right became evident when detailed information began to be available about hitherto remote and unfamiliar human societies. These societies had been speculated about science time immemorial, but they could not be scientifically investigated until new, easier, and quicker ways of getting about the world made it possible for scholars to visit and observe them. Initially, the reports of 18th and 19th century missionaries and travelers in Africa, North America, the Pacific, and elsewhere provided the raw material upon which the first Western anthropological works, written in the second half of the last century, were based. Before then, there had been plenty of conjecturing about human institutions and their origins, to say nothing of earlier times in the 18th century. Hume, Adam Smith, and Ferguson in Britain, and Montesquieu, Condorcet, and others on the continent had written about primitive institutions. Although their speculations were often brilliant, these thinkers were not empirical scientists. Their conclusions were not based on evidence which could be tested. On the contrary, their speculations were deductively argued from principles which were, for the most part, implicit in their own cultures. They were really philosophers and historians of Europe, not anthropologists, as we would now understand the term. The common view that was that civilized men could have nothing profitable to learn from studying the way of life of a lot of savages. It is reported that even at the end of the 19th century, the famous Sir James Fraser, when asked if he had ever seen one of the primitive people about whose customs he had written so many volumes, responded with, "God forbid." In an important sense, these writers were the forerunners of modern social anthropologists. Modern social anthropology owes much to these 19th century scholars, in spite of their misconceptions. Although they were mainly preoccupied with the reconstruction of a past which was lost forever, they were like their successors, interested in social institutions and the interrelations between the cultural and social institutions of different societies. By the end of 19th century, a considerable amount of miscellaneous ethnographic information had been assembled from all over the world. The most celebrated collection is that of James Fraser. His compilation of religious beliefs and practices was published in several editions around the turn of the century as the Golden Bough. In this work, Fraser, starting with the idea found in ancient Roman myth that the priest ruler, as representative of a god, should be slain and replaced by another before his powers waned, collected a vast body of information about primitive religious and magical practices throughout the world. Like his predecessors, Fraser was mainly interested in origins, but he did claim that social anthropology, he was one of the first to apply the adjective social to the discipline, should seek regularities of or general laws. The laws he had in mind, however, were those exemplified in the earlier stages of human society and were represented, so he and the evolutionists believe, by existing primitive societies. Like most of his contemporaries, Fraser was still concerned by isolated customs reported from various parts of the world largely by people with little or no scientific training, and so considered apart from the living social context that could give them real meaning. Fraser's approach is very different from that of modern social anthropologists. Even so, the literary skill and imaginative sweep of his work caught the imagination of both scholars and the general reader in the West. As the quantity of ethnographic information increased and its quality gradually improved, it began to dawn on some scholars that this material was too important to be used merely to illustrate preconceived ideas about primitive peoples or about presumed earlier stages of human societies. More and more, this extensive ethnography was seen to demand some sort of comparative analysis in its own right. Practical concerns stimulated this interest. Colonial administrators and missionaries began increasingly to see that their work would benefit by an understanding of the social and cultural institutions of the populations that they dealt with. Some of the best of the earlier monographs on the simpler societies were written by serving missionaries and administrative officers and will be discussed below. Aided by the colonial enterprise at the turn of the century, there began to develop a scientific concern with a systematic undertaking of first-hand field studies of human communities that had hitherto been known to scholars only through the piecemeal observations of non-professional observers. Individual field studies, a few of very high quality, had been made earlier. Franz Boas' research among the Eskimos in the 18th and 18th was a notable example, and so was Morgan's work among the Iroquois Indians, undertaken undertaken more than a generation before. But it was in the early 19th centuries that the systematic collection of the information in the field, covering a wide segment of the social and cultural life of particular peoples, came to be generally regarded as an essential part of, of the social anthropologist's task. An important stimulus in British anthropology was the Torres Strait expedition in 1898, in which a team of anthropologists led by A.C. Haddon undertook a comprehensive field survey of a part of Melanesia. Later, Radcliffe Brown's study of the Andaman Islanders, undertaken before the First World War, and Malinowski's work in the Trobriand Island of the Western Pacific during World War I, became particularly important influences in modern social anthropology. It was with the change of interest from the reconstruction of past societies to the investigation of contemporary societies that modern social anthropology began. From this time forward, social anthropologists were no longer satisfied with the collection of isolated pieces of information about particular customs or institutions. However, skillfully this might be woven into theoretical schemes, or however wide-ranging the comparisons based on them. It no longer seemed as worthwhile as it had to Fraser to collect huge numbers of examples of totemic practice or first fruit ceremonies from all periods of history and from all corners of the world. Primitive societies had at least come into their own. They were no longer merely a vast storehouse from which all kinds of exotic materials could be drawn by the diligent researcher. It was now recognized that, however differently they were from the familiar states of Western Europe, they were nonetheless systematically organized and viable communities. So, for the first time, the question arose: how are these unfamiliar social and cultural systems to be understood? The answer was attempt by French sociological thought, with its analytical, intellectualist tradition. 18th and 19th century French readers, French writers about human society were much concerned by the nature of society and of human social institutions. Their interest lay rather in what human society essentially is than in the history of its development, either generally or in particular cases. Thus, Comte, like his predecessors and teacher Saint Simon, was much concerned with stressing that societies are systems, not just aggregates of individuals. Neither an African tribe nor an university town is just a collection of people, any more than a house is just a collection of bricks, or an organism just an aggregate of cells. What makes these entities something more than merely the totality of their component parts is the fact that these parts are related to one another in certain specific and recognizable ways. In the case of human communities, the more or less enduring relationships between different peoples are what we refer to when we speak of societies. The French thinker saw that if societies were systems, they must be made up of interrelated parts. They also thought that these parts must be related to one another and to the whole society of which they were parts, in accordance with laws analogous to the laws of nature, which in principle, at least, it should be possible to discover. So the understanding of societies and of society with a capital S, like the understanding of the physical organisms with which they were either explicitly or implicitly being compared, was to be achieved by discovering the laws of social organization that operated to maintain the whole structure. This organismic approach to the study of human societies has some grave limitations and can be misleading, but it did point to the important truth: what the customs and social institutions of human communities are somehow interconnected, and that changes in one part of the system may lead to changes in other parts. When this was understood, it became possible to ask, and sometimes even to answer, questions about real human societies, questions which arouse less readily so long as the piecemeal view of human cultures, which had hitherto been dominant, prevailed. Thus, an anthropologist faced with a custom such as mother in law avoidance, which is found in many societies far remote from one another, was no longer content merely to record it for purposes of comparison with other apparently similar customs elsewhere. He now asks about implications of the institution for husband-wife relations or for the pattern of residence. This organismic approach reached its most sophisticated expressions in the writings of the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who is still one of the most important influences in social anthropology. My concern here is to stress that the two most important strains from which the fabric of modern social anthropology is woven are the fact finding, empirical, graphic tradition represented by British and by much German and American anthropology, and the holistic, analytical, intellectual of French social philosophy. Can we then, at this point, give a preliminary statement of what modern social anthropology is about? Anthropology is, by definition, the study of man, but no one discipline can possibly study man in all his aspects, though some anthropologists have written as though it could. On the whole, social anthropologists have concentrated on the study of man in his social aspects, that is, in his relationships with other people in living communities. The multivarious dimensions of the social and cultural life of more complex, little literate societies have for the most part been left to historians, economists, political scientists, sociologists, and a host of other specialist scholars. Of course, the anthropologist is interested in people. They are the raw material he works with. As social anthropologist, however, his main concern is with what these people share with other people. The the institutionalized aspect of their culture. For this reason, social anthropologists are not interested in every social relationship in the societies they study. They concentrate mainly in those which are habitual, relatively enduring features of the societies in which they occur. The emphasis today is essentially empirical and functional. Contemporary social anthropology is centrally a study of relationships between different kinds of people at a higher level of abstraction of relationships between relationships. Let, let me make this clear. The social anthropologist is not just interested in the relationship between, for example, a particular chief and a particular subject. He is, as we have just noted, interested in the kinds of relationships between chiefs and subjects that are characteristic of the society being studied, and of which the particular case is an example. Further, he is interested in the implications that the institutionalized chief subject relationship has for other institutionalized relationships in the society. For example, the relationships between different kinds of kin or the system of land holding. We shall find that in modern social anthropology, the emphasis is contextual and relational. Recent social anthropology may claim to have contributed most significantly to this kind of contextual understanding in the Western social sciences, but anthropologists are today being increasingly associated with practical problems outside the classroom and their solutions. The UNO and the governments in the British Commonwealth, the United States, and elsewhere have made much use of trained social anthropologists. They have done this in various ways. First, they have added trained sociologists or social anthropologists to their permanent staffs. Thus, the anthropologist becomes a civil servant. As such, his primary business is with practical problems upon which he brings to bear the techniques and special knowledge with which his professional training has equipped him. Government anthropologists have been asked to advise on such matters as labor migration, succession to political authority in particular tribes, and the likely social consequences of proposed land reforms. An anthropologist who takes such a post becomes a sort of anthropological general practitioner. For anthropologists of practical bent, there is much to be said for such a career, and if a government locates the right employee, it is well served. Some African governments have successfully made use of professional social anthropologists in this way. Such employers, whether they are governments, missionaries, or businessmen, should allow their anthropologists sufficient leisure to enable them to keep reasonably abreast of current theoretical developments in their fields, as well as permitting them wide latitude in their approaches to the problems set for them. A second way in which a government can make practical use of social anthropology is to employ a professional on contract for a period of a year or two to carry out a specific piece of research. This method can work well when a particular problem is considered sufficiently important to justify the expense of full scale professional study. An anthropologist who has made a special study of religious institutions might be hired to investigate the emergence in a particular area of a separatist movement, or an expert on political organization might be engaged to make a study in a community for which major in administrative changes were proposed. The Sudan government employed the anthropologists Evans Pritchard and Nadel in this way before World War II. For such specialized tasks, governments do best to select experienced and established scholars rather than young anthropologists without previous field experience. First, field studies are best controlled and financed through universities or other research bodies, and the social anthropologist on his first tour of field work is still very much a student. If he is to become a full-fledged professional, his supervision should be academic rather than administrative. A third method by which governments have availed themselves of information provided by anthropological investigation is by supporting, encouraging, or merely tolerating research by workers academically attached to universities or other research sponsoring bodies. B. Anthropology and other science of man. So social anthropologists study people's custom, social institutions, and values. and the ways in which these are interrelated. They carry out their investigations mainly in the context of contemporary small scale communities, and their central, though not their only interest, is in systems of social relations. It is useful to say something about social anthropology's relationship to other branches of anthropology, and also to certain other social science. In Britain, the term anthropology loosely designates a number of different branches of study which are more or less closely associated, although sometimes the association derives rather from the historical fact that they develop together as evolutionary studies of man, and were originally taught together. Then, from an intrinsic relationship, thus physical anthropology, prehistoric archaeology, primitive technology, ethnology, and ethnography are usually subsumed with social anthropology under the rubric anthropology, which sociology is not, even though its problems and methods overlap to a considerable degree with those of social anthropology. So, it is not a bit surprising that the word anthropology means different things to different people, even when it is qualified by the adjective social. Anthropology still suggests to some people an interest in bones and head measurements, to others a concern with prehistoric man and his works, to yet others an obsessive interest in exotic, preferably, prefer- preferably sexual customs, because of the confusion which the ambiguity of the word anthropology has caused. Perhaps it would be a good thing if another name could be found for the subject we are concerned with. Unfortunately, no one has yet been able to suggest a better one. Let us discuss briefly the present relationship between the social anthropology, as the subject is understood in Britain and the Commonwealth, and some other kinds of anthropology, namely physical anthropology, prehistoric archaeology or prehistory, ethnography and ethnology, and cultural anthropology. I will then consider its relationship with history and psychology. Social anthropology has some concern with other branches of knowledge too: political science, economics, human geography, agronomy, even philosophy and theology, to name a few. This relationship is not surprising, since social anthropologists claim to take at least some account of the whole social and cultural lives of the peoples they study, and all of these disciplines are concerned with aspects of human culture, although social anthropology often borrows from and sometimes lends to these other studies. The borderline between them and anthropology is not a matter of ambiguity of disagreement. In the case of the subjects discussed in this section, however, the link with social anthropology is not only close, but it is also often confused and sometimes disputed. On the European continent, anthropology means physical anthropology. This discipline is concerned with man as a physical organism, and with his place in the scheme of biological evolution. It deals with such topics as the classification of the early forms of man, the physical differences between the races of the species, Homo sapiens, human genetics, and the modes of physiological adaptation and reaction to different physical environments. This study is important and interesting, but it has little to do with the analysis of people's social institutions and beliefs. It is now usual, at least in Britain, to distinguish ethnography from ethnology. The term ethnography refers to descriptive accounts of human societies, usually of those simpler, small scale societies which anthropologists have frequently studied. In this sense, ethnography may be said to be the raw material of social anthropology. However, descriptive studies imply some generalization and comparison, either explicit or implicit. The term ethnology was formerly used as the kind of blanket term to designate almost all of the anthropological studies, including physical anthropology and prehistory. It is still sometimes used in America and on the continent, but British social anthropologists have found it useful to restrict it to studies of the preliterate people and cultures, which attempt to explain their present in terms of their remote past. In this sense, ethnology is the science of ethnology is the science which classifies people in terms of their racial and cultural characteristics, and attempts to explain this by reference to their history of or to their prehistory. To take a concrete example, investigations into the origin of a particular type of canoe are ethnological investigations, while inquiries about its contemporary use and its practical and symbolic significance for the people who have it fall within the scope of social anthropology. Nowadays, a distinction is often drawn, as I have already indicated, between social anthropology and cultural anthropology. Culture has been variously defined since Sir Edward Tyler described it nearly a century ago as the complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, moral, morals, law, custom, and other capabilities and habit acquired by man as a member of society. In this broad sense, culture refers to the whole range of human activities which are learned and not instinctive, and which are transmitted from generation to generation through various learning processes. Often the physical products of human activity are included under the term as material culture. Thus understood, cultural anthropology obviously covers an exceedingly broad field, including practically all the non-biological aspects of human life, man's social institutions and values. Social anthropology's central concerns occupy only a small part of this range. To study this whole range of activity would be difficult, and most British social anthropologists consider culture to extend a concept to be designated a specific field for systemic study. A century ago, one scholar might have been able to deal with the whole life of man, at least of primitive man. In this massive scale, advances in anthropological knowledge and techniques may have made it possible now. In fact, cultural anthropology has broken down to many specialist fields such as linguistics, acculturation, and personality studies, ethnomusicology, and the study of primitive art. On the whole, American scholars have laid more stress on cultural than on social anthropology, which some of them have regarded as a more restricted interest concerned mainly with social structure. The broader view of the content of the subject has led to a wide dispersal of interest over a variety of fields, such as acculturation studies and learning theory, many of which have been little developed British anthropology, the broader view has also involved a concern with particular aspects or items of culture, with what have been called culture traits, rather than with the analysis of cultures or societies as systematic wholes. Much American anthropology is nearer to ethnology, as defined above, than it is to social anthropology as it is understood in Britain. In America, the concern with items of culture rather than with social systems may be partially due to the nature of the ethnographic material most readily available to scholars in that country. Most British social anthropology is based on field studies of people whose societies are still going concerns, such as island populations in the Pacific and tribal societies in Africa. Until recently, American researchers have had much less access to such live material. Many, though by no means all, of the North American Indian groups among which American anthropologists work had long ago ceased to exist as viable societies, although their members often preserve extensive knowledge of their traditional cultures. In America, problems of social and political organization could not present themselves with the same urgency as they did in the study of the still viable societies of Africa and the Pacific. Thus, less work has been done in America than in Britain and the Commonwealth in the analysis of actual communities as working social systems. The field in which recent British social anthropology has made its main contribution. There are important exceptions to this generalization, but it is significant that some modern British social anthropologists would claim that they have been more influenced by the writings of American sociologists than by those of American anthropologists. In America, cultural anthropologists emphasize the study of symbols and examine how such symbols explain individual and group behavior in society. Clifford Geertz, one of the leading indiv- one of the leading American anthropologists, writes of culture. The concept of culture is essentially a semiotic one, believing with Max Weber that man is an animal suspended in webs of significance he himself has spun. I take culture to those webs and the analysis of it to be therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. It is explication I am after, considering social expressions on their surface enigmatical. In contrast, British anthropology, terming itself social anthropology, looks at social structure and organization with a view to explaining society. Following is an example of how these different schools interpret the same society differently. Clifford Geertz at Princeton and Ernest Gellner at London, two of the most prominent Western anthropologists, and both leading their distinct schools of anthropology on either side of the Atlantic, have studied Moroccan society. To the former, society is to be interpreted as in his book Meaning and Order in Moroccan Society, 1989. through the souk or market and relationships that arise from transactions generated in buying and selling. The market becomes symbolic of relationships in society and helps explain larger societal behavior and society. In contrast, Ernest Gellner, who worked among the Berbers in the Atlas Mountain 1989, 1969, and 1981, found social life is organized on the basis of principles characteristic of segmentary tribal society. However significant, these differences in approach and their importance can be exaggerated. It must be remembered that for the most part they imply only our difference in emphasis. They do not, or at least they should not, imply that social anthropologists and cultural anthropologists study different subject matter. Whether the observer's main interest is in society or in culture, the reality which he observes, people in relation to the one another, is one and not two. Cultural and social anthropologists sometimes ask different kinds of questions, but however we distinguish this, there is a good deal of overlap. So much for the relationship between social anthropology and other kinds of anthropology. I turn now to its relationship with some other social sciences. First of all, with history. Historians are chiefly interested in the past, whether remote or recent. Their business is to discover what was happened and why. On the whole, they are more interested in particular sequences of past events and their conditions than they are in the general patterns, principles, or laws which these events exhibit. Although the two disciplines are different, social anthropology has a very close relationship with history in two important ways. First, an anthropologist who aims to achieve as complete an understanding as possible of the present condition of the society can hardly fail to ask how it came to be as it is. Although his central interest is in the present, the past may be directly relevant in explaining the present. In the 20s and 30s, some social anthropologists, reacting against the pseudo historical hypothesis of the preceding generation, went so far as to imply that history could never be relevant for social anthropologists, whose proper concern was with structural relations, not with historical ones. Some of Radcliffe Brown's earlier writings expressed this view, though he later repudiated. Few social anthropologists today adopt so extreme an approach. Many of them have worked in advanced relatively advanced communities that have document history. Also, European contact and the changes which have followed from it have provided histories, not always happy ones, for societies which formerly had none. So, most modern social anthropologists do take account of the histories of the societies they study, where historical material is available and where it is relevant to the understanding of the present. Second, the study of social change is by definition a historical one, though it makes use of sociological categories as well. Though they are different, the aims and methods of social anthropologists and historians coincide in some degree. Historians use documentary evidence infrequently available to anthropologists, and anthropologists employ first-hand observation rarely possible for historians. Both are concerned with the description and understanding of real human situations, and they use whatever methods are available and appropriate to this purpose. Like historians, and unlike natural scientists, a social anthropologist can make the way of life of the creators he studies intelligible to us only in so far as he manages to convey to us something of what it will be like to participate in that way of life. His task is largely one of interpretation. An anthropologist who tries to understand why African chiefs in a selected tribe act as they do is not engaged in an enterprise essentially different from that of a historian who is trying to understand why Roman emperors of a particular period act as they did. Both anthropologists and historians attempt to represent unfamiliar social situations in terms not just for their own cultural categories, but as far as possible in terms of the categories of the actors themselves. The main difference between anthropology and history lies not so much in the subject matter, though generally this does differ, as in the degree of generality with which is which it is dealt. Once again, it is a question of emphasis. Historians are interested in the history of particular institution in particular places, Parliament in England, for example, or the Habsburg monarchy, but they are also concerned implicitly, if not explicitly, with the nature of these institutions themselves. A social anthropologist who is concerned with the role of chiefs in a particular society must be a historian to the extent of studying the careers and activity of individual chiefs. Unless he does so, his account will be empty, formal, and unconvincing. Although, in a general, anthropologists, like sociologists, are concerned with what is general and typical, this dichotomy is too simple. As so often in the social sciences, the difference is largely one of emphasis. Social anthropology is not psychology, although, like science, which deal with human affairs, it constantly makes us psychological terms and concepts. Psychology is concerned with the nature and functioning of individual minds, and although it is generally accepted that human mentality is a product of social conditioning, the study of that mentality differs in important ways from the study of the social and cultural environment which is its context. Rather, as in the study of history, tendency to deny that psychology can have any relevance for social anthropology is now being replaced by a recognition of the important contribution it can make to the understanding of people's social behavior. This recognition is associated with social anthropology's concern with what people think and with their systems of beliefs, symbols, and values. The impact of fruit in social anthropology as on human thinking generally has been considerable, though for the most part indirect. His one incursion into anthropology, his theory of the origin of totemism, is hardly convincing, but his massive demonstration of primacy of symbolic, irrational elements in human thought has had far-reaching influence on the subject. In fact, every field anthropologist must be, to a considerable extent, a practicing psychologist. An important part of his job is to discover what the people he is studying think, never a simple task. Ideas and values are not given as data. They they must be inferred, and there are many difficulties and dangers in such inferences, particularly when they are made in the context of an unfamiliar culture. It may well be that there is much to be learned through the techniques of depth psychology about the less explicit values of other cultures, as well as about those of our own, especially about the symbolism involved in rituals and ceremonies. But a word of warning is necessary. The incautious application of unfamiliar cultures of concept and assumptions derived from psychological research in Western society may lead, and indeed has led, to gross distortion. The Oedipus complex, for example, is something to be proved, not assumed, in other cultures. To sum up, the association of psychology with physical anthropology, prehistoric archaeology, and prehistory is historical only. Today, social anthropology has little or no concern with this subject. It shares its subject matter with ethnology, and with it possesses a common base in ethnography. The questions it asks are not ethnological, but relate rather to contemporary society and culture. Its emphasis differs from that of cultural anthropology. Although social anthropologists are concerned with culture too, anthropologists use history, but for a purpose not itself strictly historical. That is, to understand the present, they also use psychological concept, though their chief interest is in the society and culture in which individuals participate rather than in the individuals themselves. Okay, thank you. Maybe that's from me. I have reading all of this uh, to the page 24 and maybe a little more. Social anthropologists, more than other social scientists, need to have some acquaintance with the concepts and the methods of a number and subjects. The simpler, small scale societies which they usually study, and many of the institutionalized social relationships and values in which they are interested, are in fields which is more complex cultures, are studied by specialist disciplines. Thus, for example, social anthropologists who study primitive law should know at least some of the vocabulary of law and jurisprudence. Those who are concerned with relationships of political power and authority should know some of the categories of political science, and those interested in production and exchange in the societies they study should know those of economics. The social anthropologists claim to treat this and other specialized subjects in the context of his own studies is less arrogant than it may seem. The relationships which such subjects comprise are, for the most part, small in scale and relatively simple in context. They are effective on a person-to-person level, and since they are for the most part comprehensible to non-specialist member of the cultures concerned, they are also comprehensibly to the anthropologist who has really learned the culture, nor in the primitive cultures which social anthropologists study. Does the understanding of social and cultural institution require, as it would in literate societies, the mastering of numerous books and documents. Thus, when social anthropologists, in the restricted context of the small scale communities in which they work, investigate the several dimensions of social and cultural life, their investigation does not demand the lengthy specialist training necessary for the study of any one of these dimensions in a complex, illiterate society. Thank you. This from me. I have read until the B, and the rest of it is not necessary to read for me because I have achieved 1 hour length of the video. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.